This episode is brought to you by Progressive. Progressive helps you compare direct auto rates from a variety of companies so you can find a great one, even if it's not with them. Quote today at Progressive.com to find a rate that works with your budget. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, August 14th, 1846, Henry David Thoreau leaves the cabin where he was staying near Walden Pond. He'd been living there alone for about a year at this point, and he walks into the nearby town of Concord, Massachusetts. There he runs into the town tax collector, a man named Sam Staples, who reminds Thoreau that he hadn't paid his poll tax in about 6 years or so. And Thoreau says, yeah, I'm not going to pay that poll tax. What are you going to do, throw me in jail? And that is what Sam Staples does. He throws Thoreau in jail. Thoreau spends the night in jail. Ralph Waldo Emerson comes and visits him that night. And then Thoreau returns to his cabin. About a year later, he leaves the woods, leaves Walden Pond, and as we likely know, he writes that book that he is most famous for, Walden Pond, also known as Life in the Woods. It would become a touchstone for those looking for a simpler life, a connection to nature. But Thoreau's night in jail and his refusal to pay that poll tax also tell us about his political side. He gave lectures and wrote several essays on civil disobedience at the same time that he was talking about his time spent alone in the woods. So let's talk about Henry David Thoreau, who we haven't really talked about on this podcast, which I'm really kind of surprised to learn as I was researching this. We'll get into the personal and political side of him and his legacy on both fronts. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Kellie, how far do you live from Walden Pond?
Like 40 minutes at the most, if there's traffic. I was just there for my anniversary.
Really?
Dave and I were celebrating 19 years. We're like, let's go to Walden Pond. And so we went there. It's a National Historic Site, so you can see his cabin that he wrote in. It looks like something you might see like on a dated Airbnb. Like it's like a small little studio cabin that I kind of would like. Like if I had a she shed or something in my backyard, this would be my retreat.
Yeah.
Like it's got like a little fireplace and like his bed and then like a little writing desk, and it's very, very small. I mean, it's small, but you could imagine how someone might go there to get away. But he's known as like the father of the environmental movement. I mean, when he writes Walden Pond, it kicks off this way of thinking about nature and being and isolationism in a whole new different way. And I mean, I get it, because you go to Walden Pond, it's beautiful. It's surrounded by, it's a huge pond surrounded by trees. But he's also known for being an abolitionist. His family, they were big proponents of anti-slavery. They helped harbor and rescue fugitive slaves. His family was also very well off. He's a graduate of Harvard. He has like all of this sort of upper crust society going for him in a way where he can kind of escape things that other people just can't.
Well, can we linger on that, though, for a second? Because, look, I went to Camp Thoreau in Vermont,
nice.
Which, as you can imagine, super hippie lefty camp in Vermont named after Thoreau. I've read many, many years ago, I read Walden Pond, and I think I have a pretty favorable notion. But certainly there is a version of Thoreau's story that you can tell, if you're being cynical, where it's like, rich kid who has the means to disappear for a couple years, gets his friend to lend him a cabin in the woods, which isn't really actually that isolated. Like, he can walk into town. And he just has one of these little, like, kind of, if he was living now, he'd be one of those people. This is, again, the cynical version, but he'd be one of those people who goes on like a 2-week ayahuasca yoga retreat to Costa Rica and comes back and tells you everything they have to know about the secrets of the universe, and writes an essay and says, I've unlocked it.
No, look, this is his gap year.
Yes. Tell me if I shouldn't be so cynical about this guy, given, these other things.
That's not completely wrong. Like, there's elements of truth to that for sure. I mean, I appreciate his love of nature. I appreciate certainly his anti-slavery stance. I mean, his family was wholeheartedly into the abolitionist movement, putting a lot on the line. But he's privileged, and that's, it is what it is.
Yeah. And I mean, he's one of those people, Kellie mentioned that he was the sort of father of the environmental movement, but he's kind of the father of a bunch of other movements as well, including he could kind of be the father of the libertarian movement, because there's a way to tell this story of Thoreau being jailed that slots very neatly into a lot of different worldviews, including the libertarian one. So basically, you mentioned in the introduction, Jody, that he was jailed for not paying his taxes. There certainly is a lineage of tax revolts in the United States that he fits very neatly into. Mm-hmm. But I think the reason that he becomes kind of a touchstone is because of the reason he says that he doesn't pay his taxes. He doesn't want to support a nation that endorses slavery. Mm-hmm. And so he ties it to this bigger moral mission, which I think is one of the reasons why this has such staying power. So he goes to jail. He says, I'm not paying my taxes. As you mentioned, Ralph Waldo Emerson comes and visits him and says very famously, what are you doing in there, Henry? And he famously responds back, what are you doing out there, Ralph? And that idea that when there are unjust laws, the only place for a just man to be is in prison is really encapsulated in this moment. And so he becomes, through this experience of being in prison, kind of an archetype for a kind of, as we'll talk about, civil disobedience, which he sort of the author of that term and becomes the touchstone for civil disobedience in not just the United States, but in the world after this. It's worth noting, he spends like a night in jail.
Right.
Yeah.
And isn't it his mom comes in and pays his taxes?
His aunt comes in and is like, I got you. Pays the tax. He insists on being in jail, even though she paid the tax. And
he's like, I'm doing something here.
It's research. It's gonzo journalism. Yes.
And the sheriff is like, get out of here.
He spends one night in jail and then he talks about it for the next 10 years. But,
he's like, I'm hardcore.
But let's go a little to this civil disobedience, and more specifically, his family and his anti-slavery stance, because I'm curious how we place him within the very different strains of anti-slavery abolitionism that are brewing in this moment. And it seems to me like it's not exactly that he just sees slavery as a moral wrong, but he sees it as denying individual agency to people, which he thinks is the biggest sort of moral injustice there is. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's, parsing it a little too much, but it does seem to stem from the very things that he then would become known for, which is just kind of everything we have to rely on is already within ourselves, and anything that gets in between us and ourselves is abhorrent.
I do think that, there's an element to this that I think is courageous. I think there's an element to this that's very ethical and moral. And I also push back a little bit on Thoreau because I feel like he's operating from a place where he doesn't necessarily have much to lose. So if you are an enslaved person, if you are a free Black person living in the North, you don't sort of have the luxury of sitting in jail as a form of protest. There's real consequences and harms that come when the carceral state comes for you. And I kind of think Thoreau looks at this more as a badge of honor or a protest, and less the realities that could really impact his life had it run the course that it would with any other regular person, So the fact that he has an aunt that's just I paid the bill is not something that most Black people can experience.
Yeah. And I think the one thing that I will say, because it could be, if you want to be super cynical, you could say, well, this was just somebody who didn't want to pay his taxes and came up with a reason for it. But his family's involvement was more material than that. Mm-hmm. They housed a number of fugitive slaves. Mm-hmm. He would escort them to the next safe house. And there is a danger in that, especially at a time when people who have escaped enslavement are being hunted down. So there is a risk that he is taking, and a commitment to the cause of abolition that is stronger than just, I'm going to spend this one night in jail.
Yeah. And, he goes on to support John Brown and become one of the sort of most vocal supporters of John Brown. And, his language is pretty strident. I mean, he writes later in Civil Disobedience, which is the book that, on Walden Pond was kind of not really recognized in its own time, and Civil Disobedience certainly was not. But, he writes, "It is not a man's duty as a matter of course to devote himself to the eradication of any, even the most enormous wrong. He may still properly have other concerns to engage him, but it is his duty, at least, to wash his hands of it and not to give practically his support." So we hear that parsing there of, okay, maybe you don't need to put your... What's that phrase from the 60s? Body on the gears of the machine,
Right.
But you need to at least distance yourself from it. So, it's a subtle stance. And I guess, Kellie, how common is that in the North especially, where there is a kind of like moral outrage? I think there's people taking stances. Maybe people are like trying to deny paying taxes that they feel like support a thing. But there's a distance too, right? There's not slavery in the community itself. So in some sense, I guess it's like, what can you do other than maybe pick up and go to the South and protest or something?
Yeah, and it depends on how you're looking at the end of slavery too. Are you looking at it as a moral issue? Is this a political issue? Is this an economic issue? Because there are some people that are like, okay, we're going to boycott, products from slavery or things like that nature. There are some people like, no, this is political and we need to be in the fight and we need to be running for Congress. And people like, Thaddeus Stevens or Charles Sumner, people that used their political position to bolster the abolitionist movement. There are people who saw it as maybe sort of a double-edged sword, the way you could use politics. But then there are people like Garrison that even though they think slavery is wrong, they're not willing to use physical violence to thwart it. Right. It's complicated.
So Garrison's the one who burned the Constitution, right? So,
Yeah.
there's just a whole spectrum of sort of stances you can take, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Which is what's so interesting about the longevity of Thoreau. You mentioned Mario Salvo's speech, throwing your body against the gears of the machine to make it stop. He would have been one of those people who was probably invoking Thoreau in the 1960s, right? He was one of those touchstones for a variety of different liberation movements, Gandhi in India, to Martin Luther King Jr., who I think learns this theory of civil disobedience through Gandhi and Howard Thurman, and then it comes down to Martin Luther King Jr. And so there's this lineage that Thoreau becomes part of, that I think even if his abolitionism or anti-slavery sentiment was kind of in the middle of where people against slavery in the 19th century sat, he then becomes part of a more radical tradition because of the way that his writings and his example are used in the 20th century.
Yeah. Certainly when you think about Gandhi and King, for that matter, being thrown in prison and spending time in jail and seeing jail as a form of political protest, I think a lot of that tracks.
Yeah. And look, if you measure someone's impact by the kind of legacy they leave on others and the way they inspire others, then, I'll take it. This is pretty remarkable, right? The number of people who have found meaning in Thoreau's work, including the, Walden stuff. And look, I think we've all been 22 to 26, and trying to find ourselves. And look, I've found myself by spending like 20 minutes on the beach. I don't need to go to the cabin for 2 years. So, I think like it's totally valid. And I fully believe that's a sort of personal journey and the political journey are really connected. And I think Thoreau, at the very least, sort of shows that, right? As
there's something to be said for retreat, for sure.
Right. And you got to find yourself before you can then try and kind of make your mark on the world, I think. And so they're related projects for sure. We should give a shout out before we end. We mentioned that his family is pretty well-to-do. They're basically pencil magnates. I didn't know this, but basically his father had developed a new method by which to make pencils. And then Henry actually kind of mastered it and was like a master pencil maker. And then he kind of just said, no, I want to go my own way. But
it's like, I don't want to be a pencil pusher.
I like that. There you go. I like it. He declared that life is, quote, too valuable to put into lead pencils, which is a great little stance and probably broke his father's heart. But oh well. All right.
Listen, those number twos, they come in handy.
Seriously, that's a perfectly reasonable legacy to leave on the world.
Right.
Too.
Also very long-lived. Yep.
Yes.
All right. Well, let's leave it there. Other than... Wait, Kellie, coming back to, why did you choose Walden Pond as your anniversary spot?
Oh, we wanted to go to a beach where I wouldn't run into anyone I know.
Oh, yeah.
And we wanted to be local because it was just like we just took an afternoon. We weren't going to go far. So we're like, Walden Pond, that's about 45 minutes away. Let's do it.
Amazing.
I love it.
It was great. It was wonderful.
Well,
it was really relaxing.
I'm going to be in like Central Mass in a few weeks, and I actually went before we started taping and Googled how far from Walden Pond I'm going to be, and I'm not that far, so I might go. Maybe we can meet up there.
It's worth it. Yeah, we'll meet up. We'll do lunch.
All right. And speaking of Massachusetts, we should also say, as you've been hearing, we do have that live show in Boston on September 13th. So I don't know. Maybe we can do a late night retreat out to Walden Pond after it. If things get a little rowdy,
in Walden Pond.
Skinny dipping in Walden Pond. We'll see. But yeah, we do have this live show September 13th, Friday in Boston at the WBUR live event space. So there's a link to tickets on our website and in the show notes and on social media and all that stuff. But since we're talking about that region, worth giving a shout out. All right, that brings us to the end of the episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.